Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flying podcast. Today is part 2 of the Scientific Outlook by Bertrand Russell. Pavlov. Let's make sure everything's working. Yeah, we got the mute. Okay, we're good. Yeah. All right. Each fresh advance of science into a new domain has produced a resistance analogous in kind to that encountered by Galileo, but growing steadily less in vehemence. Traditionalists have always hoped that somewhere a region would be found to which scientific method would prove inapplicable. After Newton, they abandoned the heavenly bodies in despair. After Darwin, most of them admitted the broad fact of evolution, though they continue to this day to suggest that the course of evolution has not been guided by mechanistic forces, but has been directed by a forward-looking purpose. The tapeworm we are supposed to suppose has become what it is, not because it could not otherwise have survived in human intestines, but because it realizes an ideal laid up in heaven, which is part of the divine mind. As the Bishop of Birmingham says, the loathsome parasite is the result of the interduration of mutations. It is both an exquisite example of adaptation to environment and ethically revolting. This controversy is not yet wholly concluded, though there can be little doubt that mechanistic theories of evolution will prevail completely before long. One effort of the doctrine of evolution has been to compel men to concede to animals some portion, at least, of the merits that they have claimed for Homo sapiens. Descartes maintained that animals are mere automata, while human beings have free will. Views of this kind have lost their plausibility, though the doctrine of emergent evolution, which we shall consider at a later stage, is designed to rehabilitate the view that men differ qualitatively from other animals. Physiology has been the battleground between those who regard all phenomena as subject to scientific method and those who still hope that among vital phenomena there are some, at least, which demand mystical treatment. Is the human body a mere machine governed wholly by the principles of physics and chemistry? Wherever it is understood, it is found to be so, but there are still processes which are not completely understood. Perhaps in them a vital principle will be found to be lurking. In this way, the champions of vitalism become the friends of ignorance. Let us not, they feel, know too much about the human body, lest we should discover to our dismay that we can understand it. Every fresh discovery makes this view less plausible and restricts the territory still open to the obscurantists. There are some, however, who are willing to surrender the body to the tender mercies of the scientist, provided they can save the soul. The soul, we know, is immortal and has cognizance of right and wrong. The soul, if it belongs to the right person, is aware of God. It reaches out after higher things and is informed by a divine spark. This being the case, it surely cannot be governed by the laws of physics and chemistry, or indeed by any laws at all. Psychology, therefore, has been more obstinately defended by the enemies of scientific method than any other department of human knowledge. Nevertheless, even psychology is becoming scientific. Many men have contributed to this result, but none more than the Russian physiologist Pavlov. Pavlov was born in the year 1849 and devoted the bulk of his working life to the investigation of the behavior of dogs. This, however, is too wide a statement. The bulk of his work consisted merely of observing when dogs' mouths water and how much. This illustrates one of the most important characteristics of scientific method, as opposed to the methods of metaphysics and theologians. The man of science looks for facts that are significant in the sense of leading to general laws, and such facts are frequently quite devoid of intrinsic interest. The first impression of any non-scientific person when he learns what is being done in some famous laboratory is that all the investigators are wasting their time on trivialities. But the facts that are intellectually illuminating are often such as are in themselves trivial and uninteresting. This applies in particular to Pavlov's speciality, namely the flow of saliva in dogs. By studying this, he arrived at general laws governing a great deal of human behavior, of animal behavior, and of the behavior of human beings likewise. The procedure is as follows. Everyone knows that the sight of a juicy morsel will make a dog's mouth water. Pavlov puts a tube into the dog's mouth so that the amount of saliva to which the juicy morsel gives rise can be measured. The flow of saliva when there is food in the mouth is what is called a reflex. That is to say, it is one of those things that the body does spontaneously and without the influence of experience. There are many reflexes, some very specific, some less so. Some of these can be studied in newborn infants, but some only arise at later states of growth. The infant sneezes and yawns and stretches and sucks and turns its eyes towards a bright light and performs various other bodily movements at the appropriate occasions without the need of any previous learning. All such actions are called reflexes, or in Pavlov's language, unconditioned reflexes. They cover the ground that was formerly covered by the somewhat vague appellation of instinct. Complicated instincts such as nest building in birds appear to consist of a series of reflexes. In the lower animals, reflexes are very little modified by experience. The moth continues to fly into the moth continues to fly into the flame even after it has singed its wings. But in higher animals, experience has a great effect upon reflexes, and this is the most of all the case with man. Pavlov studied the effect of experience upon the salivary reflexes of dogs. The fundamental law is the law of conditioned reflexes. When the stimulus to an unconditioned reflex has been repeatedly accompanied or immediately preceded by some other stimulus, this other stimulus alone will in time equally produce the response which was originally called forth by the stimulus to the unconditioned reflex. The flow of saliva is originally called forth only by the actual food in the mouth. Later on, it comes to be called forth by the sight and smell of the food, or by any signal which habitually precedes the giving of food. In this case, we have what is called a conditioned reflex. The response is the same as in the unconditioned reflex, but the stimulus is a new one, which has become associated with the original stimulus through experience. This law of the conditioned reflex is the basis of learning, of what older psychologists call the association of ideas, of the understanding of language, of habit, and of particularly everything in behavior that is due to experience. On the basis of the fundamental law, Pavlov has built up experimentally all kinds of complications. He has not only the stimulus of agreeable food, but also of disagreeable acids, so that he can build up in the dog responses of avoidance as well as responses of approach. Having formed a conditional reflex by one set of experiments, he can proceed to inhibit it by another. If a given signal is followed sometimes by pleasant results and sometimes by unpleasant ones, the dog is apt to suffer in the end a nervous breakdown. He becomes hysterical or neurasthenic, and indeed a typical mental patient. Pavlov does not cure him by making him reflect upon his infancy or confess to a guilty passion for his mother, but by rest and bromide. He relates a story which should be studied by all educationists. He had a dog to whom he always showed a circular patch of bright light before giving him food, and an elliptical patch before giving him an electric shock. The dog learned to distinguish clearly between circles and ellipses, rejoicing in the former and avoiding the latter with dismay. Pavlov then gradually diminished the electric of the eclipse, making it more, the eccentricity of the eclipse, making it more and more nearly resemble a circle. For a long time, the dog continued to distinguish clearly. As the form of the ellipse was brought closer and closer to that of the circle, we obtained more or less quickly an increasingly delicate differentiation. But when we used an ellipse whose two axes were as 9 to 8, i.e. an ellipse which was nearly circular, all this was changed. We obtained a new delicate differentiation which always remained imperfect, lasted 2 or 3 weeks, and afterwards not only disappeared spontaneously but caused the loss of all earlier differentiations, including even the less delicate ones. The dog, which formerly stood quietly on his bench, now was constantly struggling and howling. It was necessary to elaborate anew all the differentiations, and the most unrefined now demanded much more time than at first. On attempting to obtain the final differentiation, the old story was repeated, i.e. all the differentiations disappeared and the dog fell again into a state of excitation. I am afraid a similar procedure is habitual in schools and accounts for the apparent stupidity of many of the scholars. Pavlov is of opinion that sleep is essentially the same thing as inhibition, being in fact a general instead of a specific inhibition. On the basis of his study of dogs, he accepts the view of Hippocrates that there are 4 temperaments, namely choleric, melancholic, sanguine, and phlegemic. The phlegemic and sanguine he regards as the saner types, while the melancholic and choleric are liable to nervous disorders. He finds his dogs divisible into these 4 types and believes the same to be true of human beings. The organ through which learning takes place is the cortex, and Pavlov considers himself as being engaged upon the study of the cortex. He is a physiologist, not a psychologist, but he is of opinion that where animals are concerned, there cannot be any psychology such as we derive from introspection when we study human beings. With human beings, it would seem that he does not go so far as Dr. John B. Watson. Psychology, he says, is so far as it concerns the subjective state of man, has a natural right to existence for our subjective world is the first reality with which we are confronted. But though the right of existence of human psychology be granted, there is no reason why we should not question the necessity of an animal psychology. Where animals are concerned, he is a pure behaviorist on the ground that one cannot know whether an animal has consciousness, or if it has, of what nature this consciousness may be. In regard to human beings also, in spite of his theoretical concession to introspective psychology, all that he has to say is based upon his study of conditioned reflexes, and it is clear that in regard to bodily behavior, his position is entirely mechanistic. One can hardly deny that only a study of the psychochemical processes taking place in the nerve tissue will give us a real theory of all nervous phenomena, and that the phases of this process will provide us with a full explanation of all the external manifestations of nervous activity, their consecutiveness, and their interrelations. The following quotation is interesting not only as illustrating his position on the point, but as showing the idealistic hopes for the human race which he bases upon the progress of science. At the beginning of our work, and for a long time afterwards, we felt the compulsion of habit in explaining our subject by psychological interpretations. Every time the objective investigation met an obstacle, or when it was halted by the complexity of the problem, there arose quite naturally misgivings as to the correctness of our new method. Gradually, with the process of our research, these doubts appeared more rarely, and now I am deeply and irrevocably convinced that along this path will be found the final triumph of the human mind over its uttermost and supreme problem, the knowledge of the mechanism and of the laws of human nature. Only thus may come a full, true, and permanent happiness. Let the mind rise from victory to victory over surrounding nature. Let it conquer for human life and activity not only the surface of the earth, but all that lies between the depth of the seas and the outer limits of the atmosphere. Let it command for its service prodigious energy to flow from one part of the universe to the other. Let it annihilate space for the transference of its thoughts. Yet the same human creature, led by dark powers to wars and revolutions and their horrors, produces for itself incalculable material losses and inexpressible pain, and reverts to bestial conditions. Only science, exact science about human nature itself, and the most sincere approach to it by the aid of the omnipotent scientific method will deliver man from his present gloom and will purge him from his contemporary shame in the sphere of interhuman relations. In metaphysics, he is neither a materialist nor a mentalist. He holds the view that I firmly believe to be the right one, that the habit of distinguishing between mind and matter is a mistake, and that reality must be considered as both or neither with equal justice. We are now coming, he says, to think of the mind, the soul, and matter all as one, and with this view there will be no necessity for a choice between them. As a human being, Pavlov has the simplicity and regularity of learned men of an earlier time, such as an Immanuel Kant. He lived a quiet home life and was invariably punctual at his laboratory. Once during the revolution, his assistant was 10 minutes late, and adduced the revolution as an excuse. But Pavlov replied, "What difference does a revolution make when you have work in the laboratory to do?" The only allusion to the troubles of Russia to be found in his writings is in connection with the difficulty of feeding his animals during the years of food shortage. Although his work has been such as might be held to give support to the official metaphysic of the Communist Party, he thought very ill of the Soviet government and denounced it vehemently both publicly and privately. In spite of this, the government treated him with every consideration and supplied his laboratory generously with everything that he needed. It is typical of the modern attitude in science, as compared with Newton or even Darwin, that Pavlov has not attempted a statuesque perfection in the presentation of his theories. The reason that I have not given a systematic exposition of our results during the last 20 years is the following. The field is an entirely new one, and the work has consistently advanced. How could I halt for any comprehensive conception to systematize the results, when each day new experiments and observations brought us additional facts? The rate of progress in science nowadays is much too great for such works as Newton's Principia or Darwin's Origin of Species. Before such a book could be completed, it would be out of date. In many ways, this is regrettable, for the great books of the past possessed a certain beauty and magnificence which is absent from the fugitive papers of our time. But it is an inevitable consequence of the rapid increase of knowledge and must therefore be accepted philosophically. Whether Pavlov's method methods can be made to cover the whole of human behavior is open to question. But at any rate, they cover a very large field, and within this field they have shown how to apply scientific methods with quantitative exactitude. He has conquered a new sphere for exact science and must therefore be regarded as one of the great men of our time. The problem which Pavlov successfully tackled is that of subjecting to scientific law what has hitherto been called voluntary behavior. Two animals of the same species, or one animal or two different occasions, may respond differently to the same stimulus. This gives rise to the idea that there is something called a will, which enables us to respond to situations capriciously and without scientific regularity. Pavlov's study of the conditioned reflexes has shown how behavior, which is not determined by the congenital constitution of an animal, may nevertheless have its own rules and be as capable of scientific treatment as is the behavior governed by unconditional reflexes. As Professor Hogben says, in our generation, the work of Pavlov's school has successfully tackled for the first time in history the problem of what Mr. Haldane calls conscious behavior. In non-teleological terms, it has reduced it to the investigation of the conditions under which new reflex systems are brought into being. The more this achievement is studied, the more important it is seen to be, and it is on this account that Pavlov must be placed among the most eminent men of our time. Chapter 2, Characteristics of Scientific Method. Scientific method has been often described, and it is not possible at this date to say anything very new about it. Nevertheless, it is necessary to describe it if we are to be in a position later to consider whether any method of acquiring general knowledge exists. In arriving at a scientific law, there are three main stages. The first consists in observing the significant facts. The second, in arriving at a hypothesis, which, if it is true, would account for these facts. The third, in deducing from the hypotheses consequences which can be tested by observation. If the consequences are verified, the hypothesis is provisionally accepted as true, although it will usually require modification later on as a result of the discovery of further facts. In the existing state of science, no facts and no hypotheses are isolated. They exist within the general body of scientific knowledge. The significance of a fact is relative to such knowledge. To say that a fact is significant in science is to say that it helps to establish or refute some general law. For science, though it starts from observation of the particular, is not concerned essentially with the particular, but with the general. A fact in science is not a mere fact, but an instance. In this, the scientist differs from the artist, who, if he deigns to notice facts at all, is likely to notice them in all their particularity. Science, in its ultimate ideal, consists of a set of propositions arranged in a hierarchy, the lowest level of the hierarchy being concerned with particular facts, and the highest with some general law governing everything in the universe. The various levels in the hierarchy have twofold logical connection. Traveling one up, one down, the upward connection proceeds by induction, the downward by deduction. That is to say, in a perfected science, we should proceed as follows. The particular facts, A, B, C, D, etc., suggest as probable a certain general law, of which, if it is true, they are all instances. Another set of facts suggests another general law, and so on. All these general laws suggest by induction a law of higher order of generality, of which, if it is true, they are instances. There will be many such stages in passing from the particular facts observed to the most general law as yet ascertained. From this general law, we proceed and turn deductively until we arrive at the particular facts from which our previous induction has started. In textbooks, the deductive order will be adopted, but in the laboratory, the inductive order. The only science which has, as yet, come anywhere near this perfection is physics. The consideration of physics may help us to give concreteness to the above abstract account of the scientific method. Galileo, as we saw, discovered the law of falling bodies in the neighborhood of Earth's surface. He discovered that apart from the resistance of the air, they fall with a constant acceleration, which is the same for all. This was a generalization from a comparatively small number of facts, namely, the causes of actual falling bodies, which Galileo had timed, but his generalization was confirmed by all subsequent experiments of a like nature. Galileo's result was a law of the lowest order of generality, as little removed from the crude facts as a general law could be. Moreover, Kepler had observed the motions of the planets and formulated his three laws as to their orbits. These again were laws of the lowest order of generality. Newton collected together Kepler's laws and Galileo's law of falling bodies and the laws of the tides and what was known as to the motions of comets in one law, namely the law of gravitation, which embraced them all. This law, moreover, as usually happens with successful generalization, showed not merely why the previous laws were right, but also why they were not quite right. Bodies near the Earth's surface do not fall with an acceleration which is quite constant. As they approach the Earth, the acceleration is slightly increased. Planets do not move exactly in ellipses. When they approach near to other planets, they are pulled a little out of their orbits. Thus, Newton's law of gravitation superseded the older generalizations, but could scarcely have been arrived at except from them. For over 200 years, no new generalization was found to swallow up Newton's laws of gravitation as it had swallowed up Kepler's laws. When at last Einstein arrived at such a generalization, it placed the law of gravitation in the most unexpected company. To everyone's surprise, it was found to be a law of geometry rather than of physics in the old sense. The proposition with which it has most affinity is the theorem of Pythagoras, to the effect that the squares of two shorter sides of a right-angled triangle are together equal to the square of the longest side. Every schoolboy learns the proof of this proposition, but only those who read Einstein learn the disproof. To the Greeks and to the moderns until 100 years ago, geometry was an a priori study like formal logic, not an empirical science based upon observation. Lobachevsky in the year 1829 demonstrated the falsehood of this opinion and showed that the truth of Euclidean geometry could only be established by observation and not by reasoning. Although this view gave rise to important new branches of pure mathematics, it did not bear fruit in physics until the year 1915, when Einstein embodied it in his general theory of relativity. It now appears that the theorem of Pythagoras is not quite true, and that the exact truth which it abdurates contains within itself the law of gravitation as an ingredient or consequent. Again, it is not quite Newton's laws of gravitation, but a law whose observable consequences are slightly different. Where Einstein differs from Newton in an observable manner, it is found that Einstein is right as against Newton. Einstein's law of gravitation is more general than Newton's, since it applies not only to matter, but also to light and to every form of energy. Einstein's general theory of gravitation demanded as a preliminary not only Newton's theory, but also the theory of electromagnetism, the theory of space spectroscopy, observation of light pressure, and the power of minute astronomical observation, which we owe to large telescopes and the perfecting of the technique of photography. Without all these preliminaries, Einstein's theory could not have been both discovered and demonstrated. But when the theory is set forth in mathematical form, we start with the generalized law of gravitation and arrive at the end of our argument at those verified consequences upon which, in the inductive order, the law was based. In the deductive order, the difficulties of discovery are obscured, and it becomes hard to be aware of the immense extent of preliminary knowledge required for the induction which led to our major premise. The same sort of development has happened with a rapidity which is truly astonishing in regard to the quantum theory. The first discovery that there were facts necessitating such a theory was made in 1900. Yet already the subject can be treated in an utterly abstract way which scarcely reminds the readers that a universe exists. Throughout the history of physics from this time of Galileo onward, the importance of the significant fact has been very evident. The facts that are significant at any one stage in the development of a theory are quite different from those that are significant at another stage. When Galileo was establishing the law of falling bodies, the fact that in a vacuum a feather and a lump of lead fell equally fast was more important than the fact that in air a feather falls more slowly, since the first step in understanding falling bodies consisted in realizing that so far as the Earth's attraction alone is concerned, all falling bodies have the same acceleration. The effect of the resistance of the air must be treated as something superadded to the Earth's attraction. The essential thing is always to look for such facts as illustrate one law in isolation, or at any rate only in combination with laws whose effects are well known. This is why experiment plays such an important part in scientific discovery. In an experiment, the circumstances are artificially simplified so that some one law in isolation may become observable. In most concrete situations, what actually happens requires for its explanation a number of laws of nature. But in order to discover this one by one, it is usually necessary to invent circumstances such that only one of them is relevant. Moreover, the most instructive phenomena may be very difficult to observe. Consider, for example, how much our knowledge of matter has been enhanced by the discovery of X-rays and of radioactivity, yet both of these would remain unknown but for the most elaborate experimental technique. The discovery of radioactivity was an accident due to the perfecting of photography. Becquerel had some very sensitive photographic plates, which he was meaning to employ, but as the weather was bad, he put them away in a dark cupboard in which there happened to be some uranium. When they were taken out again, they were found to have photographed the uranium in spite of the complete darkness. It was this accident which led to the discovery that uranium is radioactive. This accidental photograph afforded another illustration of the significant fact. Outside physics, the part played by deduction is much less, while the part played by observation and by laws immediately based upon observation is much greater. Physics, owing to the simplicity of its subject matter, has reached a higher state of development than any other science. I do not think it can be doubted that the ideal is the same for all sciences, but it can't be doubted whether human capacity will ever be able to make physiology, for example, as perfect a deductive edifice as theoretical physics is now. Even in pure physics, the difficulties of calculation swiftly become insuperable. In the Newtonian gravitation theory, it was impossible to calculate how three bodies would move under their mutual attractions, except approximately where one of them was much larger than the other two. In the theory of Einstein, which is more complicated than Newton's, it is impossible to work out with theoretical exactness how often two bodies will move under their mutual attraction, though it is possible to obtain a significantly good approximation for all practical purposes. Fortunately for bodies, there are methods of averaging by which the behavior of large bodies can be calculated with a quite sufficient approximation to the truth. Although a whole exact theory is utterly beyond human powers. All of this may seem a paradox. All exact science is dominated by the idea of approximation. When a man tells you that he knows the exact truth about everything, you are safe in inferring that he is an inexact man. Every careful measurement in science is always given with a probable error, which is a technical term conveying a precise meaning. It means that the amount of error which is just as likely to be greater than the actual error is to be less. It is characteristic of these matters in which something is known with exceptional accuracy that in them every observer admits that he is likely to be wrong, and he knows how much wrong he is likely to be. In matters where the truth is not ascertainable, no one admits that there is the slightest possibility of even the minutest error in his opinions. Who ever heard of a theologian prefacing his creed or a politician concluding his speeches with a statement as to the probable error in his opinions? It is an odd fact that the subjective certainty is inversely proportional to objective certainty. The less reason a man has to suppose himself in the right, the more vehemently he asserts that there is no doubt whatever that he is exactly right. It is a practice of theologians to laugh at science because it changes. Look at us, they say. What are we asserted at the Council of Nicaea, we still assert, whereas what the scientists assert only 2 or 3 years ago is already forgotten and antiquated. Men who speak in this way have not grasped the great idea of successive approximations. No man has the scientific temper, asserts what is now believed in science is exactly right. He asserts that it is a stage of the road towards exact truth. When a change occurs in sciences, for example, from Newton's laws of gravitation to Einstein's, what had been done is not overthrown, but it's replaced by something slightly more accurate. Suppose you measure yourself with a rough apparatus and come to the conclusion that you are 6 feet tall. You would not suppose, if you were wise, that your height was exactly 6 feet, but rather that your height was, say, between 5'11" and 6'1". And if a very careful measurement showed that your height was within the tenth of an inch, 5 feet 11 and 9/10 inches, you would not consider that had overthrown the previous result. The previous result was that your height was about 6 feet, and this remains true. The case with the changes in science is precisely analogous. The part played by measurement and quantity in science is very great, but is, I think, sometimes overestimated. Mathematical technique is powerful, and men of science are naturally anxious to be able to apply it whenever possible. But a law may be quite scientific without being quantitative. Pavlov's laws concerning conditioned reflexes may serve as an illustration. It would probably be impossible to give quantitative precision to these laws. The number of repetitions required to establish conditioned reflexes depends upon many conditions and varies not only with different animals, but with the same animal at different times. In the pursuit of quantitative precision, we should be driven first to the psychology of the cortex and the physical nature of nerve currents, and we should find ourselves unable to stop short of the physics of electrons and protons. There, it is true, quantitative precision may be possible, but to pass back by calculation from pure physics to the phenomena of animal behavior is beyond human power at any rate at present, and probably for many ages to come. We must therefore, in dealing with such a matter as animal behavior, be content in the meantime with quantitative laws, which are nonetheless scientific for not being quantitative. One advantage of quantitative precision, where it is possible, is that it gives much greater strength to inductive arguments. Suppose, for example, that you invent a hypothesis according to which a certain observable quantity should have a magnitude which you work out to 5 significant figures. And suppose you then find by observation that the quantity in question has this magnitude. You will feel that such a coincidence between theory and observation can hardly be an accident, and that your theory must contain at least some important element of truth. Experience shows, however, that it is easy to attach too much importance to such coincidences. Bohr's theory of the atom was originally commended by a remarkable power of calculating theoretically certain quantities which had until then been unknown only by observation. Nevertheless, Bohr's theory, though a necessary stage in progress, has already been virtually abandoned. The truth is that men cannot frame sufficiently abstract hypotheses. Imagination is always intruding upon logic and causing men to make pictures of occurrences which are essentially incapable of being visualized. In Bohr's theory of the atom, for example, there was a highly abstract constituent which was in all likelihood true. But this abstract element was embedded in imaginative details which had no inductive justification. The world that we can picture is the world that we see, but the world of physics is an abstract world that cannot be seen. For this reason, even a hypothesis which accounts with a minute exactitude for all known relevant facts must not be regarded as a certainly true, since it is probably only some highly abstract aspect of the hypothesis that is logically necessary in the deductions which we make from it to observable phenomena. All scientific laws rest upon induction, which, considered as a logical process, is open to doubt, and not capable of giving certainty. Speaking crudely, an inductive argument is of the following kind. If a certain hypothesis is true, then such and such facts will be observable. Now these facts are observable, therefore the hypothesis is probably true. An argument of this sort will have varying degrees of validity according to circumstances. If we could prove that no other hypothesis was compatible with the observed facts, we could arrive at certainty, but this is hardly ever possible. In general, there will be no method of thinking of all the possible hypotheses, or if there is, it will be found that the more than one of them is compatible with the facts. When this is the case, the scientist adopts the simplest as a working hypothesis and only reverts to more complicated hypotheses if new facts show that the simplest hypothesis is inadequate. If you had never seen a cat without a tail, the simplest hypothesis to account for this fact would be all cats have tails. But the first time that you saw a Manx cat, you would be compelled to adopt a more complicated hypothesis. The man who argues that because all cats he has seen have tails, therefore all cats have tails, is employing what is called induction by simple enumeration. This is a very dangerous form of argument. In its better forms, induction is based upon the fact that our hypotheses lead to consequences which are found to be true, but which, if they had not been observed, would be extremely improbable. If you mean a man who has a pair of dice that always throw double sixes, it is probable that he is lucky, but there is another hypothesis which would make these observed facts less astonishing. You will therefore be well advised to adopt this other hypothesis. In all good inductions, the facts accounted for by the hypothesis are such as would be antecedently improbable, and the more improbable they would be, the greater becomes the probability of the hypothesis which accounts for them. This, as we remarked a moment ago, is one of the advantages of measurement. If something which might have any size is found to have just the size the hypothesis had led you to expect, you feel that your hypothesis must at least have something in it. As common sense, this seems evident, but as logic, it has certain difficulties. This, however, will not be considered until the next chapter. There was one remaining characteristic of scientific method about which something must be said, namely analysis. It is generally assumed by men of science, at any rate, as a working hypothesis, that any concrete occurrence is the result of a number of causes, each of which, acting separately, might produce some different result from that which actually occurs, and that the resultant can't be calculated when the effects of the separate causes are known. The simplest examples of this occur in mechanics. The moon is attracted both by the Earth and by the sun. If the Earth acted alone, the moon would describe one orbit. If the sun acted alone, it would describe another. But its actual orbit is calculable when we know the effects which the Earth and the sun separately would produce. When we know how falling bodies fall in a vacuum and also the law of the resistance of the air, we can calculate how bodies will fall in air. The principle that causal laws can in this way be separated and then recombined is in some degree essential to the procedure of science. For it is impossible to take account of everything at once or to arrive at causal laws unless we can isolate them one at a time. It must be said, however, that there is no reason a priori to suppose that the effect of two causes acting simultaneously will be calculable from the effects which they have severally. And in the most modern physics, this principle is found to have less truth than was formerly supposed. It remains a practical and approximate principle in suitable circumstances, but it cannot be laid down as a general property of the universe. Undoubtedly, where it fails, science becomes very difficult. But so far as it can be seen at present, it retains sufficient truth to be employed as a hypothesis, except in the most advanced and delicate calculations. Chapter 3, Limitations of the Scientific Method. Whatever knowledge we possess is either knowledge of particular facts or scientific knowledge. The details of history and geography lie outside science in a sense. That is to say, they are presupposed by science and form the basis upon which it is a superstructure. The sort of things that are demanded on a passport, such as name, date of birth, color of grandfather's eyes, etc., are brute facts. The past existence of Caesar and Napoleon, the present existence of the earth and the sun and the other heavenly bodies may also be regarded as brute facts. That is to say, most of us accept them as such, but strictly speaking, they involve inferences which may or may not be correct. If a boy learned history were to refuse to believe in the existence of Napoleon, he would probably be punished, which might, for a pragmatist, constitute sufficient proof that there was such a man. But if the boy were not a pragmatist, he might reflect that if his teacher had any reason to believe in Napoleon, the reason might have been disclosed. Very few teachers of history, I believe, would be able to prove any good argument to show that Napoleon was not a myth. I'm not saying that such arguments do not exist. I'm only saying that most people do not know what they are. Clearly, if you are going to believe anything outside of your own experience, you should have some reason for believing it. Usually, the reason is authority. When it was first proposed to establish laboratories at Cambridge, Todd Hunter, the mathematician, objected that it was unnecessary for students to see experiments performed since the results could be vouched for by their teachers, all of them men of the highest caliber, and many of them clergymen of the Church of England. Todd Hunter considered that the argument from authority should suffice, but we all know how often authority has been proved mistaken. It is true that most of us must inevitably depend upon it for most of our knowledge. I accept on authority the existence of Cape Horn, and it is clearly impossible that each of us should verify all the facts of geography. But it is important that the opportunity for verification should exist, and that it is occasionally necessary should be recognized. To revert to history as we proceed into the past, there is a gradually increasing doubt. Did Pythagoras exist? Probably. Did Romulus exist? Probably not. Did Remus exist? Almost certainly not. But the difference between the evidence for Napoleon and the evidence from Romulus is only one of degree. Strictly speaking, neither the one nor the other can be accepted as a mere matter of fact, since neither comes within our direct experience. Does the sun exist? Most people would say that the sun does come within our direct experience in a sense in which Napoleon does not, but in thinking this, they would be mistaken. The sun is removed from us in space as Napoleon is removed from us in time. The sun, like Napoleon, is known to us only through its effects. People say they see the sun, but that only means that something has traveled through the intervening 93 million miles and produced an effect upon the retina, the optic nerve, and the brain. This effect, which happens where we are, is certainly not identical with the sun as understood by astronomers. Indeed, the same effect might be produced by another means. In theory, a hot globe of molten metal could be hung up in such a position that to a given observer, it would seem just like the sun. The effect upon the observer might be made indistinguishable from the effect which the sun produces. The sun, therefore, is an inference from what we see and is not the actual patch of brightness of which we are immediately aware. It is characteristic of the advance of science that less and less is found to be datum, and more is found to be inference. The inference is, of course, quite unconscious, except in those who have trained themselves to philosophical skepticism. But it must not be supposed that any unconscious inference is necessarily valid. Babies think that there is another baby on the other side of the looking glass, and although they have not arrived at this conclusion by logical process, it is nevertheless mistaken. Many of our unconscious inferences, which are in fact conditioned reflexes acquired in early infancy, are highly dubious as soon as they are subject to logical scrutiny. Physics has been compelled by its own necessities to take account of some of these unwarranted prejudices. The plain man thinks that matter is solid, but the physicist thinks that it is a wave of probability undulating in nothingness. To put it briefly, the matter in a place is defined as the likelihood of you seeing a ghost there. For the moment, however, I am not yet concerned with these metaphysical speculations, but with the features of the scientific method which have given rise to them. The limitations of the scientific method have become much more evident in recent years than they have ever were before. They have become more evident in physics, which is the most advanced of the sciences, and so far these limitations have had little effect upon the other sciences. Nevertheless, since it is a theoretical goal of every science to be absorbed in physics, we are not likely to go away if we apply to science in general the doubts and difficulties which have become obvious in the sphere of physics. The limitations of scientific method may be collected under three heads: the doubt as to the validity of induction, the difficulty of drawing inferences from what is experienced to what is not experienced, and three, even allowing that there can be inference to what is not experienced, the fact that such inference must be of an extremely abstract character and gives therefore less information than it appears to when ordinary language is employed. All right, induction. All inductive arguments in the last form reduce themselves to the following form: if this is true, that is true. Now that it is true, therefore this is true. This argument is, of course, formally fallacious. Suppose I were to say, if bread is a stone and stones are nourishing, then this bread will nourish me. Now, this bread does nourish me, therefore it is a stone and stones are nourishing. If I were to advance such an argument, I should certainly be thought foolish, yet it would not be fundamentally different from the arguments upon which all scientific laws are based. In science, we always argue that since the observed facts obey certain laws, therefore other facts in the same region will obey the same laws. We may verify this subsequently over a greater or smaller region, but its practical importance is always in regard to these regions, where it has not yet been verified. We have verified the laws of statistics, for example, in countless cases, and we employ them in building a bridge. In regard to the bridge, they are not verified until we find that the bridge stays up. But their importance lies in enabling us to predict beforehand that the bridge will stay up. It is easy to see why we think it will. This is merely an example of Pavlov's conditioned reflexes, which cause us to expect whatever combinations we have frequently experienced in the past. But if you have to cross a bridge in a train, it is no comfort to you to know why the engineer thought it was a good bridge. The important thing is that it should be a good bridge, and this requires that his induction from the laws of statistics in observed cases to the same laws in unobserved cases should be a valid one. Now, unfortunately, no one has hitherto shown any good reason for supposing that this sort of inference is sound. Hume, nearly 200 years ago, threw doubt upon induction, as indeed upon most other things. The philosophers were indignant and invented refutations of Hume which passed muster on account of their extreme obscurity. Indeed, for a long time, philosophers took care to be unintelligible, since otherwise everybody would have perceived that they had been unsuccessful in answering Hume. It is easy to invent a metaphysic which will have as a consequence that an induction is valid, and many men have done so, but they have not shown any reason to believe in their metaphysic except that it was pleasant. The metaphysic of Bergson, for example, is undoubtedly pleasant, like cocktails, and enables us to see the world as a unity without sharp distinctions, and all of it vaguely agreeable. But it has no better claim than cocktails have to be included in the technique for the pursuit of knowledge. There may be valid grounds for believing in induction, and in fact none of us can help believing in it, but it must be admitted that in theory induction remains an unsolved problem of logic. And as this doubt, however, affects particularly the whole of our knowledge, we may pass it by and assume pragmatically that inductive procedure with proper safeguards is admissible. 2. Inferences to what is not experienced. As we have observed above, what is actually experienced is much less than one would naturally suppose. You may say, for example, that you see your friend, Mr. Jones, walking along the street, but this is to go far beyond what you have any right to say. You see a succession of colored patches traversing a stationary background. These patches may be a means of a Pavlov conditioned reflex, bringing into your mind the word Jones, and so you say you see Jones, but other people looking at their windows from different angles will see something different owing to the laws of perspective. Therefore, if they are all seeing Jones, they must be as many different Joneses as there are spectators, and if there is only one true Jones, the sight of him is not vouchsafed to anybody. If we assume for a moment the truth of the account which physics gives, we shall explain what you call seeing Jones in some such terms as following. Little packets of light called light quanta shoot from the sun, and some of these reach a region where they are atoms of a certain kind composing Jones's face and hands and clothes. These atoms do not themselves exist, but are merely a compendious way of alluding to probable occurrences. Some of the light quanta, when they reach Jones's atoms, upset their internal economy. This causes them to become sunburned and to manufacture vitamin D. Others are reflected, and of those that are reflected, some enter your eye. They there cause a complicated disturbance of the rods and cones, which in turn sends a current along the optic nerve. When this current reaches the brain, it produces an event. The event which it produces is that which you call seeing Jones, as is evident from this account. The connection of seeing Jones with Jones is remote, roundabout causal connection. Jones himself, meanwhile, remains wrapped in mystery. He may be thinking about his dinner, or about how his investments have gone to pieces, or about that umbrella he lost. These thoughts are Jones, but they are not what you see. To say that you see Jones is no more correct than it would be if a ball bounced off a wall in your garden and hit you, to say that the wall had hit you. Indeed, the two cases are closely analogous. We do not, therefore, ever see what we think we see. Is there any reason to think that what we think we see exists, although we do not see it? Science has always prided itself on being empirical and believing only what could be verified. Now, you can verify the occurrences in yourself, which you call seeing Jones, but you cannot verify Jones himself. You may hear sounds, which you call Jones speaking to you. You may feel sensations of touch, which you call Jones bumping into you. If he has not lately had a bath, you may have the olfactory sensations of which you suppose him to be the source. If you have been impressed by this argument, you may address him as if you were at the other end of the telephone and say, "Are you there?" And you may subsequently hear the words, "Yes, you idiot, can't you see me?" But if you regard these as affording evidence that he is there, you have missed the point of the argument. The point is that Jones is a convenient hypothesis by means of which a certain of your own sensations can be collected into a bundle. But what really makes them belonging together is not their common hypothetical origin, but a certain resemblance and causal affinities which they have to each other. These remain even if their common origin is mythical. When you see a man in the cinema, you know that he does not exist when he is off the stage, though you suppose that there was an original who did exist continuously. But why should you make this supposition? Why should not Jones be like the man you see at the cinema? He may get annoyed with you if you suggest such an idea, but he will be powerless to disprove it, since he cannot give you any experience of what he is doing when you do not experience him. Is there any way of proving that there are occurrences other than those that you yourself experience? This is a question of emotional interest, but the theoretical physicists of the present day would consider it unimportant. My formula, he would say, are concerned to provide causal laws connecting my sensations. In the statement of these causal laws, I may employ hypothetical entities, but the question whether these entities are more than hypothetical is, I don't know what that word is, a choice, since it lies outside the sphere of possible verification. At a pinch, you may admit that other physicists exist, since he wishes to use their results, and having admitted physicists, he may be led by politeness to admit students of other sciences. He may, in fact, form an argument by analogy to prove that just as his body is connected with his thoughts, so bodies closely resembling his own are probably also connected with thoughts. It may be questioned how much strength there is in this argument, but even if it be admitted, it does not allow us to conclude that the sun and stars exist, or indeed any lifeless matter. We are in fact led to the position of Berkeley, according to which only thought exists. Berkeley saved the universe from the permanence of bodies by regarding them as God's thoughts. But this was only wish fulfillment, not logical thinking. However, as he was at once a bishop and an Irishman, we ought not to be too hard on him. The fact is that science started with a large amount of what Santayana calls animal faith, which is in fact thought dominated by the principle of the conditioned reflex. It was this animal faith that enabled physicists to believe in a world of matter. Gradually, they have turned traitor, like men who, from studying the history of kings, have become Republicans. The physicists of our day no longer believe in matter. That in itself, however, would be no great loss, provided we could still have a large and varied external world, but unfortunately, they have not supplied us with any reason for believing in a non-material external world. The problem is not essentially one of the physical, but for the logician, it is in essence a simple one, namely, are circumstances ever such as to enable us, from a set of known events, to infer that some other event has occurred, is occurring, or will occur? Or, if we cannot make such an inference with certainty, can we ever make it with any high degree of probability, or at any rate with a probability greater than half? If the answer to this question is in the affirmative, we may be justified in believing, as we all do in fact believe, in the ups and the currents of events which we have not personally experienced. If the answer is in the negative, we can never be justified in our belief. Logicians have hardly ever considered this question in its naked simplicity, and I do not know of any clear answer to it. Until an answer is forthcoming one way or another, the question must remain an open one, and our faith in the external world must be merely animal faith. The abstractness of physics, even allowing that the sun, the stars, and the material world generally are not a figment of our imagination or a set of convenient coefficients in our equations, what can be said about them is extraordinarily abstract. Much more so than appears from the language employed by physicists when they attempt to be intelligible. The space and time that they deal with are not the space and time of our experience. The orbits of the planets do not resemble the pictorial ellipses which we see drawn in charts of the solar system, except in certain quite abstract properties. It is possible that the relation of contiguity which occurs in our experience may be extended to the bodies of the physical world, but other relations known and experienced are not in themselves known to exist in the physical world. The most that can be known, and that only on the most hopeful view, is that there are certain relations in the physical world which share certain abstract logical characteristics with the relations that we know. The characteristics which they share are those that can be expressed mathematically, not those that distinguish them imaginatively from other relations. Take, for example, what there is in common between a gramophone record and the music that it plays. The two share certain structural properties which can be expressed in abstract terms, but they do not share any properties that are obvious to the senses. In virtue of their structural similarity, the one can cause the other. Similarly, a physical world sharing the structure of our sensible world can cause it, even though it may resemble it in nothing except structure. At best, therefore, we can only know concerning the physical world such properties as the gramophone record and music have in common, not such as distinguish them from the other. Ordinary language is totally unsuited for expressing what physics really asserts, since the words of everyday life are not sufficiently abstract. Only mathematics and mathematical logic can say as little as the physicist means to say. As soon as he translates his symbols into words, he inevitably says something much too concrete and gives his readers a cheerful impression of something imaginable and intelligible, which is much more pleasant and everyday than what he is trying to convey. Many people have a passionate hatred of abstraction, chiefly, I think, because of its intellectual difficulty. But as they do not wish to give this reason, they invent all sorts of others that sound grand. They say that all reality is concrete and that in making abstractions we are leaving out the essential. They say that all abstraction is falsification, and that as soon as you have left out any aspect of something actual, you have exposed yourself to the risk of the fallacy in arguing from its remaining aspects alone. Those who argue in this way are in fact concerned with matters quite other than those that concern science. From the aesthetic point of view, for example, abstraction is likely to be wholly misleading. The music may be beautiful while the gramophone record is aesthetically null. From the point of view of imaginative vision, such as an epic poet may desire in writing the history of the creation, The abstract knowledge offered by physics is not satisfying. He wants to know what God saw when he looked upon the world and saw that it was good. He cannot be satisfied with formula given the abstract logical properties of the relations among the different parts of what God saw. But scientific thought is different from this. It is essentially power through the sort of thought, that is to say, whose purpose, conscious or unconscious, is to give power to its possessor. Now, power is a causal concept, and to obtain power over any given material, one need only understand the causal laws to which it is subject. This is an essentially abstract matter, and the more irrelevant details we can omit from our purview, the more powerful our thoughts will become. The same sort of thing can be illustrated in the economic sphere. The cultivator who knows every corner of his farm has a concrete knowledge of what wheat and makes very little money. The railway which carries his wheat views it in a slightly more abstract way and makes rather more money. The stock exchange manipulator who knows it only in its purely abstract aspect of something, which may go up or down, is in his way as remote from concrete reality as the physicist, and he, of all those concerned in the economic sphere, makes the most money and has the most power. So it is with science. Though the power which the man of science seeks is more remote and impersonal than that which is sought on the stock exchange. The extreme abstractness of modern physics makes it difficult to understand, but gives to those who can understand it a grasp of the world as a whole, a sense of its structure and mechanism which no less abstract apparatus could possibly supply. The power of using abstractions is the essence of intellect, in which every increase in abstraction, the intellectual triumph of science, are enhanced. Okay, so we will stop here at chapter 4 for next week. All right. Thank you, everyone. This is Todd Lewis, Praise the Flight Podcast, signing off.